Hi, I'm Judy Hancock Holland. Thanks for joining me for another photography tutorial. This presentation is all about how to take your photographs from good to wow. It was originally presented to the Canadian Association for Photographic Art on October 17th, 2023. If you find this video helpful, please hit the subscribe button for my channel and the little bell so you'll be notified of new tutorials as they appear. My goal here is to inspire you to think about your work in a slightly different way to make stronger images more consistently. I'm going to tell you about 7 strategies that you can use to get to wow. This might go without saying, but I think it's worth emphasizing. What is wow for me may be meh for you, and vice versa. Wow is in the eye of the beholder. What matters is that you learn to create work that is a wow for you, and the 7 points I'm going to cover in this presentation will help you get there. I've had lots of wows on this photo, but I don't kid myself that the wows were for my photography. They were for the experience of being that close to a 40-ton whale with a 12 to 15 foot wide tail. There's story here, and people respond to the story, regardless of the quality of the photo as a photo. It's a wow subject, but certainly not my best photo, or even in the top 1,000. The experience was a wow, but the photograph itself is only average. It's competently taken, but there's no compelling light or other compositional elements to make it an outstanding image. Though the experience was a wow, the image is not. Some years ago, National Geographic photographer Jim Richardson famously said, "If you want to be a better photographer, stand in front of more interesting stuff." You know, with all due respect to National Geographic photographers, I find this advice to be very glib and unhelpful. Have you ever seen a poor photo of the Grand Canyon? Of course you have. We've all seen mediocre photos of amazing subjects. Just pointing your camera at interesting stuff doesn't make you a good photographer. I think a more helpful suggestion would be, if you want to be a better photographer, think and see in more interesting ways. There's nothing wrong with shooting impressive subjects, but I think too often photographers rely on wow subjects and don't give enough attention to the craft of photography. If you want to make wow images, you need to move way beyond great subjects and work at creating finely crafted, emotionally impactful photographs. Edward Weston is best known for his photograph Pepper No. 30, but he routinely made wow images of ordinary subjects. This pod full of peas and the toilet are just 2 examples. Imogen Cunningham also typically shot quite mundane subjects, like this famous one, The Unmade Bed. So what makes these wow images? What springs to mind immediately is light and composition. We'll talk about each of these a bit later. I love beauty, but wow photographs don't always have to be beautiful. This famous photo is grainy and not terribly sharp by today's standards, but it's a wow image because Eddie Adams caught a moment, and it's a photograph that tells a powerfully emotional story. It was shocking in its time, and it's an image that helped stop a war. Adams won the Pulitzer Prize for it. Now, most of us are not photojournalists on assignment in war or disaster zones. Yet we can still keep moment, story, and emotion in mind as we work. Beauty is what feeds my soul, and I want to acknowledge that bias because it influences how I think and speak about this topic. You may disagree or agree with my point of view, but I hope to at least provide some food for thought. I prefer to make images of relatively everyday subjects, but in a way that showcases their beauty. I'm interested in the artistic representation of my subject rather than just relying on a wow subject. That's my photographic jam, and yours may be different. The point is, you don't have to have an extraordinary subject to make a wow image, and a wow subject isn't enough on its own to make a wow photograph. Pretty much anyone may luck out and get a wow shot once in a while, but if you want to produce wow work regularly, it takes a lot of time and effort. What makes the difference between those who reach the top of any field and those who don't is the amount of time spent in focused, purposeful learning and practicing. This doesn't just mean shooting, it means really studying and practicing to develop your skills. And according to Malcolm Gladwell, who researched the question, it takes about 10,000 hours of focused study to reach mastery. This chart shows how long it takes to get to 10,000 hours of study, based on the number of hours per week you put into it, and taking 2 weeks off per year. Even 12 years ago, when I got back into photography seriously, I knew I didn't have 66.66 years to work on it. So to get to mastery, I would need to put a lot more than 3 hours a week of study and practice into it. But photography is a passion for me. I can't not do it. For years, I've happily spent 30 to 40 hours a week honing my craft, taking workshops, reading, watching instructional videos, studying fine photographs, critiquing and being critiqued, teaching, and of course, creating images. I'm well past the 10,000 hour mark now and still working on it, though down to about 20 hours a week now. And I love that in photography, there's always more to learn. Even if you can't put this kind of time into your work, any amount of time you spend in focused study of your craft will help. I think many photographers, especially starting out, have the wrong mindset. We start out taking pictures. That's fine. That's how we think about photography in the beginning. We might move on to making pictures, but I believe we need to think in terms of crafting images. My friend John Sword is a fine craftsman who works in wood. His cherry wood rocking chair was recently entered in a gallery show that exhibited a wide variety of art pieces, from photography to ceramics, paintings, sculpture, and woodworking. His chair won Best in Show. When I chatted with John about this piece, he talked about envisioning the chair, choosing materials, thinking about how to put the pieces together into a fluid, cohesive whole, and of course, sanding and finishing. His heart and soul went into creating this labor of love. To me, that chair is a wow. And as photographers, we need to think this way. We need to craft our images thoughtfully, putting our heart and soul into them. So let's have a look at a list of things that will help you get to wow more consistently. The first on my list is train your eye. The most fundamental way to improve your photography is to work on learning to see better. When I was a kid, I subscribed to a magazine called Highlights. I loved that magazine, and one of my favorite features was the puzzle in every issue, a full-page drawing of a scene with hidden objects scattered throughout. The goal was to find all the objects. I really believe that puzzle was a key way that I started to develop my visual skills. It taught me to notice, to be observant. Little kids notice things. The world is new to them. They're curious and they take in everything. I remember being fascinated by things like the inside of a pansy. As we age, we start categorizing things. Instead of seeing every little detail of a car, the car barely registers on our consciousness unless it's threatening us or there's something really novel about its appearance. As we do this, and we have to do this or we couldn't function, we become less and less creative. When we're in a completely new environment, we may pay more attention and take it in. The novelty attracts us like it does with kids. But the answer is not in always seeking out new things, it's in seeing old things in a new way. Dr. John Land gave the NASA creativity test to various age groups. It was very interesting what he found. At age 5, people scored 98%. By age 10, that had dropped to 30%. By age 15, it was 12%, and adults scored only 2% on the test. To become more creative again, we need to learn to see like little kids see. We need to train ourselves to consciously notice things that other people don't pay any attention to. Some years ago, my sister had a bunch of dried up anthurium blossoms she removed from a plant. To her, they were nothing special, but when I saw this one, I gasped. I saw something that she didn't see. My photographer's eye saw textures and shapes and form, and I had to shoot it. I've also learned to listen to the still small voice within that says, "You've got to shoot this," even though other people and my own conventional judging brain may be saying, "Why on earth would you want to shoot something like that?" I'm still working on my noticing skills. Renowned Canadian photographer Freeman Patterson is a master of noticing. Now in his 80s and still teaching, he's been winning awards since 1965, in large part because he really knows how to see. That visual skill of noticing was taught to him by his mother when he was just a boy, and it served him well. I was fortunate to take a workshop with Freeman a few years ago. He invited the group to his property for a half day of shooting in his delightful garden. As I was walking with him, he pointed these two things out to me, things I hadn't even noticed. I don't expect to ever be perfect at this, but I keep working at it. It's a skill and a habit we need to practice, just like a professional musician continues to practice scales and exercises throughout their career. I also took a mix-song photography workshop a few years ago with Michael Wood and Julie DuBose. Mix-song means the good eye, and it's a form of mindfulness training specifically for photographers. It helped me to see better, to sharpen my eye and notice things. I took this photo of the bubbles in my glass of Coke when I took a lunch break. Later, I'll be sharing a book list that can help you develop your good eye. There are some things we can do to see more mindfully. We can eliminate distractions, noise, worries, interruptions, and these days, our phones. We can slow down and center ourselves. It's important, too, to try not to label or judge what we see. It's very normal to think in our own heads, "Oh, that's beautiful," or "That's pretty ugly," or "That shouldn't be there." But we need to suspend those judgments and be more open and curious and receptive. Just simply look without seeking. Notice from a still, receptive state of inner equanimity. And then when we see something beautiful, we really need to tune into it. Examine it the way a child might. Allow yourself to be stopped, penetrated, and pulled in by pure visual perception of what is in front of you. You can do this without your camera, of course. Just notice. You're fine-tuning your eye and your brain. As the famous photographer Elliot Erwitt said, all the technique in the world doesn't compensate for the inability to notice. So don't be in a hurry to get your shot. Sometimes being calm and receptive will get you farther than chasing an image. I had worked for over an hour trying to get an image that said something about how I felt about this calla lily and leaf. I'd tried all kinds of angles and light and so on, but I just wasn't getting what I wanted. I stopped for the day and I lay down on the couch to rest for a few minutes. I closed my eyes and just relaxed, and when I opened my eyes, I glanced up and saw this. This was the shot I wanted. The more you practice mindful seeing, the more you'll start to notice things like this: lines, texture, shapes, light, patterns, reflections. These then become compositional building blocks that we can use in our images. So try to see mindfully as you go about your everyday life, with or without your camera. Another way to practice this kind of seeing is to go out and look at and photograph things that you normally would never photograph. Ansel Adams talked about pre-visualizing an image, seeing the image in your mind's eye as you want to create it. It's a very useful concept. But it's not a matter of pre-visualizing versus noticing and being mindful and receptive. It's not an either-or. We can use the two together. We can notice and perceive our subject as it is, and then pre-visualize the image we want to create. Here, I noticed and fell in love with the curves of this tulip. Then I pre-visualized how I might create an image that made those curves really stand out. The second thing on our list is use your emotions. Emotion is fundamental in any kind of art. In order to create images with emotional impact, you have to feel the emotion yourself first. Ansel Adams said, "A great photograph is one that fully expresses what one feels in the deepest sense about what is being photographed." The contemporary architectural photographer Julia Anna Gospodaru has said, "If you don't express what you really feel, either because you don't know what you feel, or you don't know how to express it, or you want to say what you think people want to hear, your message will not be as strong as it would be if it came from an authentically felt emotion." I frequently remind myself to focus my mind and heart before I focus my camera. So try to eliminate distractions and get centered. Determine what you're most strongly attracted to in the subject. Look at it from all angles. You could even write about the subject. What do you feel? When I looked closely at this calla lily, I was moved by the sensual curves that are reminiscent of a classic female nude. That's what I wanted to convey, that sensuality. So I used a reclined position like a nude and backlighting to accentuate the curves. When you approach your subject, tune into your heart. What do you feel? At this stage of my life, my heart is particularly moved by the whole subject of aging and mortality. These dying sunflowers spoke to me of the beauty and sadness in that theme, and I used composition and lighting to convey that emotion. But maybe you're a street or sports photographer. Can you still slow down and center yourself and tune in to what you really want to say with your image? Yes, I think you can, but you likely need to do this in advance of going out. So if you're shooting a basketball game, for example, the action is fast. So before you go to the game, ask yourself what you love about basketball, and then focus your visual attention on that aspect of the game. Know what you want to say about the sport or the street life you're addressing, because how can you say it effectively if you don't? Many years ago, I was a little girl who loved horses. When I saw this little girl with the horse, all that feeling came back to me. By shooting in soft light and catching the point of contact where the girl's hands are on the horse's nose, I can convey that feeling of connection and love. And if you've ever stroked a horse's nose, that velvety softness will be brought to mind. Of course, every viewer is different. If you have no experience with horses or negative experiences, this image won't do the same thing for you. In this image, the feeling is one of innocence, gentleness, and femininity. By having her interact with the flowers and by using a high-key treatment, I can emphasize those feelings, but I needed to feel them first. This scene felt very peaceful to me. I've used horizontal lines, rectangular shapes, soft light, and cool color to convey that feeling of peace and stillness. On the other hand, the vibrant red and high contrast of this image convey boldness and even passion. And here I've caught the eagle's expression to convey his wildness. There's intensity here in the eye, and the fact that we know the eagle is screaming adds to the emotion. This older couple asked me to create an intimate portrait that would say something about their relationship. The pose, expression, and high-key treatment all contribute to a feeling of intimacy and tenderness. I created an 8x8-inch print of this with an 8-inch mat all the way around it to emphasize that we're being given a glimpse into a private moment of tenderness. In this image of tulip petals, the delicate color, the arrangement backlit by a light pad, and the soft post-processing help convey softness and sensuality. Whereas the straight upright stem, the strong color, and sensual curves here carry a sense of feminine pride and boldness, at least to me. It feels a little bit sassy to me. It's a tulip with attitude. Orcas are magnificent, mysterious creatures to me, and they are quite social animals. Portraying them in a pair like this says something about the close family relationship connections they have, and the flat blank sea adds to the sense of mystery. Here, making the subject small in a wider environment helps communicate a sense of solitariness or loneliness. This image is part of a project on addiction. The chaotic composition here has something to say about the chaos of addiction. This last example around emotion isn't my image, but I really wish it was. It was created by Canadian photographer Keijo Brando. This image speaks so eloquently of loss and yearning, it moved me to tears. Everything here has been crafted to evoke that emotion. The man's empty hand reaching out. The bracelet on the woman's arm in the mirror lying undone next to the man's hand. Even the lines on the table that lead us into the frame. She's gone to a place he can't reach, and his longing is beautifully portrayed in his reaching out to her. The heartache is palpable. This image could only be created from a place of heart, of emotion. I hope these examples show that if you want to create emotionally powerful work, you have to be willing to feel. If I don't open my heart to let my subject move me emotionally, how can I possibly create an image of that subject that moves my viewer? Let's move on to the third strategy. Study and practice visual design. Understanding visual design principles will help you create impact and emotion. When I talk about visual design, I am talking about composition, but I'm not talking about rules. We know from neuroscience and Gestalt psychology that human beings' eyes and minds typically perceive certain visual elements as attractive or as conveying certain kinds of meanings and emotions. That's what I'm really talking about. Learning about how compositional choices impact our viewers and either support or oppose our vision for an image. We don't have time here for a full look at visual design concepts and the psychology of aesthetics, but it is important to learn about them and then use them as building blocks of composition or visual design. Let's just have a quick look at line and shape, which are just two compositional elements among the many that you'll want to study and practice. Different visual elements have different psychological effects on us as viewers. Photography is a visual language. The elements of visual design can be used within that language to convey certain impressions. For example, we know that horizontal lines convey an impression of stability, peace, groundedness, calmness. This may be one of the reasons why seascapes can be so calming. There is a vast horizontal line usually at the horizon. Vertical lines, on the other hand, create a sense of growth, strength, height, stature, or grandeur. Diagonal lines are more dynamic and energetic. They can create mild tension in an image. Curves in an image feel relaxed, sensual, fluid, and may suggest movement or femininity. And zigzag lines can create a sense of excitement, tension, or even anxiety. This painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, called Black Lines, was painted in 1916, and it provides us a good example of how this works. At the bottom, we have a very strong horizontal line, which suggests the stability and the groundedness. Then we have a straight upward reaching line that represents a sense of growth and movement. And then the zigzag line does introduce that feeling of tension. We also know that shapes have a psychological effect on the viewer. Squares and rectangles tend to be seen as balanced, solid, secure, orderly, and sometimes convey a sense of the masculine. Circles are more calming. They're happy, carefree, sometimes youthful. Think of hula hoops, balloons, bubbles, balls, bikes, all of these things that go so well with kids and a carefree feeling. For some reason, triangles are particularly dynamic and attractive to our eyes, so practice seeing triangles and using them in your compositions. In addition to seeing triangles and other shapes, we can also create shapes. Triangles are a good asset to use when you're doing portraiture. A good rule of thumb to keep in mind when you're photographing people is if it bends, bend it. Bending at the joints like elbows can help us create triangles. When shooting a group, rather than putting them in lines, arrange the people so that their heads form triangles. Bend the knees and elbows for more triangles. It'll create a more dynamic composition. Can you see all the triangles here? This is much more interesting than just having a horizontal line. It's a more dynamic photograph. These are simple examples of using just two visual design principles, line and shape. There are many other principles. My point here is to learn them and use them if you want to get to wow. For more on visual design concepts, have a look at my YouTube tutorials on building blocks of composition. The fourth strategy on our Getting to Wow list is master light. George Eastman of Eastman Kodak fame said, "Embrace light, admire it, love it, but above all, know the light. Know it for all you are worth, and you will know the key to photography." The word photography means drawing or writing with light, and great light combined with great composition will take you a long way toward wow. I expect to be working for the rest of my life on mastering light, but even small improvements in how we use light can make a big difference to our images. Even very ordinary subjects can be beautiful in gorgeous light. These were simply shot in window light. Several times over the course of my photographic journey, I've hired a mentor or coach to help me to improve. Sharon Milstein was one of those coaches. I had a session with her one day, and at the end of that session, she said to me, "Judy, you've got a good handle on composition. Now you need to learn how to see light." That was the end of our session, and I thought, that's great advice, but how the heck do I do that? And I realized that I could start by noticing and paying attention to shadows, and that would help me see the light. I started at first by looking for hard-edged shadows, and then softer, more subtle ones. I started paying attention to light and shadow, wherever I could, whether I had my camera with me or not. As you start paying more attention to light and shadow, ask yourself, what's the direction of the light? Where's it coming from? How bright is it? We're talking about intensity here. Is it dim or is it very bright? How hard or soft is it? Hard light produces shadows that have very harsh edges, and soft light produces a shadow with a very soft edge or perhaps no discernible shadow at all. And light also has color. Think about the light at golden hour versus noon. And also different artificial light sources have different colors that come off them and show up in photographs. The color of the walls also has an influence on what color the light is and how that affects your subject. Here's an example of soft light, where the edges of the shadows are soft and more diffuse. I was just sitting in my living room reading a book, and someone came in and turned a light on, and I noticed this out of the corner of my eye and thought it would make an interesting image. Here we have an example of hard light. The sun is high in the sky and the shadows have hard edges. These kinds of hard shadows can be appealing in certain situations and bring about a sense of drama. Along with noticing the character of the light, whether it's hard or soft, practice identifying where the light is coming from. The sun here is a bit lower in the sky, but it's not yet golden hour. The hard light produced by the sun in a cloudless sky helps to create drama. This is another example of soft, natural light. The sun was quite high overhead, but the sun itself was not actually the direct light source. There was a large window on the left, and the actual light source is that window bringing in the light that's reflected from the surfaces outside. The window is very large compared to the subject, and it's close to the subject, and that softens the light. Here, the window was farther away, and the light is therefore harder. So here's a principle to keep in mind when you're thinking about light. A light source that is close and large in relation to the subject produces a softer light. Now the sun is huge, but because it's so far away, it's small in relation to most subjects. And if it's not diffused, if you're shooting in direct sunlight, you're going to have very hard light. Sometimes we encounter a situation where there are extremes of darkness and light. It can be helpful in those situations to expose for the highlights and allow the shadows to fall away. I typically use my histogram to expose to the right, sometimes abbreviated as ETTR, which simply means exposing so that the histogram just barely touches the right-hand edge without overexposing the highlights. This was shot in late afternoon. The sun was very, very bright, but there were also dark clouds around, and the sun was breaking through the breaks in the clouds. So here again, I've exposed for the highlights and let the shadows go very dark, even black. This photo was made outside on a bright, late morning. These fronds were catching the direct sunlight, and there was an area of deep shadow behind them. You can use this kind of light to eliminate distractions and create drama. Soft light is diffused by something. Outdoors, this might be clouds. You can also use a diffuser, or you can shoot in open shade, which is a shady area that's very close to an area of direct sunlight. Open shade creates very soft light, but still directional. And a diffuser is simply some kind of translucent material that you place between a light source and your subject to soften the light. There are many kinds of diffusers. You can buy 5-in-1 reflector sets that come with a diffuser included, or even just use a frosted shower curtain or similar material. These portraits were taken in the soft light of an overcast day. Hard light is great if you want to show every wrinkle and blemish and create a gritty, mysterious look, but often that's not what you want. I think the main point here is that there's no such thing as bad light. There's just light that is good or bad for what you want to convey. Overcast days outdoors are wonderful for forests, birds, flowers, waterfalls, and portraits. So next time you have a day that's not got much sun, think about those kinds of subjects. If we go back to the girl and the horse, we have an excellent example of open shade providing lovely soft light. Here there was a big open barn door to camera right, and that indirect side light brings out the textures and the form. You can see it in the folds of the clothing and the texture on the horse's head. The shadows are soft. Indirect window light, where the sun isn't shining directly in through the window, is a type of open shade, and it's wonderful for flowers. It really complements their softness. Lighting from the side brings out the texture, but keeps the shadows soft. If I'm shooting outdoors, I can use a diffuser and try to shoot when the sun is lower in the sky, or even just put a piece of black foam core board above the subject to block the light from coming directly down on it. Here's a rough diagram to show you how I often light my flowers. I set up with a window with indirect light to the left and a reflector to camera right. I place a backdrop maybe 2 feet behind the subject to avoid shadows falling on it. Then I move the reflector closer and farther from the subject until I get just the right amount of fill light in my shadows. I shot this image in my garage with a big open garage door on camera left. I wanted to get that side light to reveal the textures. You'll notice that the right-hand side of the image is a little darker than the left. I could have used a reflector on the right if I'd wanted a more even kind of exposure. I could also get a more even exposure by putting the garage door behind the camera, but front lighting would make the image look flat, and I'd lose that glorious texture in the leaves and the pods, and I'd lose that sense of form. There are times when you might want flatter light, like here where my subjects are women over 40. We know that side light reveals texture, so it accentuates wrinkles and skin blemishes. To minimize those, you can have your light source in front of your subject. This was front lighting from an open patio door. I was standing outside in bright sunlight, and the light on me was very hard. But they are just inside the patio door in open shade, that shaded area right next to the bright sunshine. So the light on them is very soft and flattering. Indoors, I can aim a flash at a white wall behind me to make the whole wall the light source, providing very soft front lighting to reduce the appearance of wrinkles or skin blemishes. Keep this in mind for young teenage subjects who may have imperfect skin, as well as for older subjects. It can be especially fun and effective to take control of light by using flash or constant lights like LED panels or flashlights. If you've never tried flash, or you've tried it and found it just too darn complicated, have a look at my Flash for the Scared Stiff tutorial on YouTube. There is so much to learn about light and lighting, so keep studying and experimenting, but above all, practice seeing light. Here the top left image was taken with a studio strobe in a gridded strip box. The bottom right one was taken with a flashlight. The fifth strategy for getting to wow is to develop your own style. Think about your favorite art pieces. What do you love about them? You develop your personal style not so much by deciding on a style, but by noticing what you're drawn to and concentrating on that. Here's an exercise you might find helpful in this regard. Go through your photos and pick out perhaps your 10 best pieces, photos that you really love, regardless of what anyone else thinks of them. And then for each one, write down what you love about it. Be as specific as you can, rather than just say you like the color, for example. Indicate whether it's pastel colors, bright, vibrant colors, dull colors, whatever it is. And in terms of light, rather than saying you like the light, tell us what kind of light. Soft light, hard light, side light, backlight. Be as specific as you can. And keep this list around and periodically redo the exercise. For this image, I would write down that the main compositional elements are light, shapes, form, and texture. The feelings for me are mystery, solidity, grace, and timelessness. There's a kind of a sense of peace and drama at the same time. For the purposes of this exercise, write down the feelings you get from the image, not from what you remember from being there. Once you've made your list for each of your 10 favorite images, then review it. You'll probably notice that certain compositional elements, themes, and feelings emerge as recurring elements in your best work. When I've done this exercise, I found that the feelings were generally feelings of gentleness, peace, and awe. Story really isn't very big in my work. The themes that emerged over and over again for me were aging, mortality, beauty and imperfection and impermanence, which is known by the Japanese term of wabi-sabi, sensuality, and a sense of the beauty and the sacredness in the mundane. The compositional elements in my favorite pieces were usually light, curves, form, and an overall simplicity of composition. And in terms of post-processing, often the images I liked the best in my work were black and white with my signature brown tint. The things you notice recurring in your best work are all part of your style. Try to come up with a sentence that summarizes the recurring elements you find in your very best work. The gist of my style could be summed up as simple subjects and minimalist scenes with an emphasis on curves, form, and light. Whatever qualities you find recurring in your work are a clue to your style. Once you know what elements you love in your work, then use more of those, and then your style will begin to emerge, and it may change over time. You can also do this same exercise with artworks you love from other artists. Study and analyze the artists you admire. For me, that would be Georgia O'Keeffe, Imogen Cunningham, Edward Weston, Joseph Karsh, Robert Mapplethorpe, and of course others. The goal is not to copy these artists, except perhaps as an exercise, but to reveal what you're drawn to so that you can develop that aspect in your work. I love the simplicity, the sensuality, the curves, light, and form in Imogen Cunningham's work. I'm drawn to the many of the same things in my work and others' work. What appeals to you may of course be very different, and that's fine. When I did the exercise, I thought it was interesting that all of my influences except O'Keeffe worked primarily in monochrome. And even in O'Keeffe's work, I was drawn to the primacy of form. I love the curves and the sensuality. Her color is wonderful, but that's not what I was primarily drawn to. My images are clearly not copies of O'Keeffe, but something in her work, probably the curves and the sensuality, really resonates with my heart. And in a way, the fact that O'Keeffe dared to create from her heart and personal vision encourages me to do the same. Georgia O'Keeffe was a trailblazer in making images that celebrate curves and the sensuality of nature. The boldness of her creations has inspired me to be bold and true to myself in crafting images that express my inner experience and feelings. I think you can see the commonalities, and you can also see the influence of Karsh here in my lighting. I'm moved and inspired by how Karsh lit his portraits, particularly these two of Martin Luther King Jr. and Pablo Casals. There's a simplicity here and a feeling of peace. I think you can see the influence of all of these artists in my work, but you wouldn't mistake mine for theirs. I'm not trying to copy anyone. Mine is authentically mine. There's a wonderful story about the image on the right of Pablo Casals. It was exhibited in an art museum, and there was a man who came every single day to the museum and just stood and stared at this portrait. The security guard noticed this and became curious, and one day he came over to ask why. The man said to him, "Shh, can't you see? I'm listening to the music." I want to create images that move my viewer, to have them feel something, as Karsh and my other influences did. So your style isn't something you decide on necessarily. You see images and create images and pay attention to what you're really drawn to, and then work to refine and develop that, whatever that is, and then that becomes your style. Your style may well change over time, but it needs to emerge from within you, not as a copy of anyone else, but as an authentic expression of you. Working in series can be a great way to hone your style. Choose a subject you're drawn to and make many images of that subject. The first few are going to be really easy, but then you have to really work the subject to find new ways to depict it. This will challenge you and develop your creativity, and also help you develop a body of work. I've done many series and expect to do many more. So far, I've been pulled to do series of adobe buildings, of elders' hands, of sunflowers, whales, calla lilies, and several other things. Choose something you're really interested in or you really love and work with that for a while. The very first series or project that I tackled was to shoot elders' hands. It was prompted by memories of my grandmother's hands. Although my husband was pretty skeptical when I told him I wanted to photograph elders' hands, I chose to follow my heart, and it paid off for me. A series of 6 of my hand portraits won honorable mention in the Julia Margaret Cameron International Awards and were exhibited in Barcelona. A project on calla lily leaves led to an honorable mention award in the 2023 International Minimalist Photography Awards. Again, a very ordinary subject, but working in series helped me to find interesting ways to portray it. 2 years earlier, this series of 5 adobe buildings was awarded honorable mention in the same competition. Again, not really a wow subject, but the composition, light, and technical quality led to their success. So choose a subject you really love and just get started. I love the cello, and I rented one for a month to photograph it, exploring it in all kinds of different ways. Another subject that I chose to explore was ballroom dance competitions. I don't dance, but I love to watch ballroom dancing, and I've done a large series of these. So I urge you to take on a series or a project. The subject can be almost anything, but stick with it for a while and shoot it a number of different ways. It'll help you find your style, which is another way to make progress towards wow. Number 6 on our list of strategies is to polish your post-processing skills. Now, some of you I know may not be keen on post-processing, but hear me out on this. Of course you want to get the best initial capture that you can, but you can take your work up several notches by learning some basic post-processing skills, especially if you shoot in RAW. If you shoot JPEG, the camera does all the post-processing for you and makes all those creative choices. But RAW files are just that, raw data that is usually pretty flat looking. They're like digital negatives, and it's up to you as the skilled photographer to turn them into beautiful finished images. And the beauty of it is the creative possibilities in this are really pretty exciting. Skilled photographers since the very beginning have used post-processing to polish their images. Ansel Adams was a master in the darkroom, dodging and burning to create drama. It was old school post-processing. Adams considered a negative to be like a musical score, and the print to be like the performance. And you might be surprised to see what his famous piece, Moonrise Hernandez, looked like before Adams did his post-processing, his dodging and burning in the darkroom. This is the contact print of Moonrise Hernandez. Adams was a master post-processor. He skillfully adjusted the tones in his images to express his vision. Now get this, Adams clicked the shutter for Moonrise Hernandez in 1941. He got the first print that he was satisfied with in the 1970s. And in 1980, 39 years after he clicked the shutter, he was still continuing to fine-tune the post-processing, the darkroom work. He made over 1,300 prints of this photograph. That's dedication. That's mastery. That's wow. I've seen various prints of this photo at the Center for Creative Photography, which Adams established in Tucson, Arizona. And they are all a bit different. Post-processing was less precise in the days of darkroom, and Adams gave the prints he made from his negative slightly different interpretations. He was the first to admit this scene and others he photographed were not, quotes, real, but rather his interpretation of the scene. Adams wanted to show you not what a scene looked like, but what it felt like. That's a worthy goal for all of us, and post-processing is one of the tools that Adams used to do that. We can do the same. At the very least, learn how to adjust tones and colors in post as Adams and his contemporaries did. It's not as hard to learn as you might think. Adams certainly wasn't alone in doing meticulous processing work. Here's a portrait of actor James Dean that Dennis Stock took in Times Square in 1955. He post-processed the negative to create the print that he envisioned. On the left, you see his unaltered contact print with Stock's notes for post-processing, and on the right is the finished piece. This is Dennis Stock's portrait of Audrey Hepburn. You can see that this was common practice among serious photographers. They didn't just click the shutter and let the enlarger decide how the print should be rendered. I've sometimes heard people argue against post-processing, saying, well, Ansel Adams didn't use Photoshop, why should I? Well, no, but only because it wasn't available. He did the equivalent refining of his images in the darkroom and wouldn't have dreamed of releasing the unprocessed print. If he were alive today, I think he'd be all over Photoshop, not to fix images, but to fine-tune them to fit his vision. Of course, there are so many apps for processing your raw files. It can be a bit daunting if you're new to it. The latest version of Lightroom Classic is a great place to start, as it's great for organizing your work as well as for doing all the basic refinements. But make sure that you understand how its file management works first before you launch into using it, or you can make quite a mess. My YouTube video on file management in Lightroom will help you with that. If you'd rather not use Adobe's apps, there are lots of other options. Talk to your photographer friends and read reviews online to help you choose. There's a learning curve, of course, with any software. It's not a bad idea to use what your friends are using so that you can help each other out. Once you've learned the basics of dodging and burning and so on, then you may want to look into some of the more creative possibilities with your software. Here I've added a texture to the background of this leaf, and that's helped me to make the image more cohesive. Once you've done the basic dodging and burning, leveling horizons, things like that, ask yourself if there's anything else that you could do with the image to better convey your vision or achieve your vision. Just follow your heart and play with it. For example, this image was taken during the day, but turning it into a night scene conveyed more of what I felt when I was there. There's almost infinite scope for creativity when you learn to post-process, and there's always more to learn. This started out as a very simple photograph of a nautilus shell taken on my iPhone, and I've turned it into an abstraction. You can experiment with some artistic effects, like I've done here with this building in St. John, New Brunswick. This old cemetery in Chester, Nova Scotia felt rather spooky to me, so I've used post-processing to bring out that feeling. Developing your post-processing skills can open the door to composite work like this, or creating abstracts like this triptych created from a photo of a tree trunk. Sometimes I enjoy even going a little wilder than that. This is the same iPhone nautilus shell shot that's been turned into an image that has some emotional power. My latest project focuses on what I'm calling digital etchings. A portfolio of these will be published in Amateur Photographer magazine in the UK in early 2024. This kind of creative work is fun for me, and it allows for self-expression. You don't have to learn everything about post-processing all at once. Just start with the basics and be meticulous. Use post to refine your image and make it sing, not to fix it. And a word to the wise, it's very easy to overdo things in post, so be careful about that. This brings us to the last on our list of 7 strategies for getting to wow, and that is seek constructive feedback. You can start by frankly assessing your own images. Look at them with a critical eye and evaluate the emotional impact, the composition, the light, and the post-processing. Now, it can be really hard to be objective about your own work. So once you've done the best job you can, then you're ready for some outside critique. But please, don't ask for critique or join a critique group if what you really want is just to share your work and hear the accolades. The purpose of a good critique group is to offer you gentle, respectful, but candid feedback that evaluates the strengths and the weaknesses of your image and is actually useful in helping you improve. For a downloadable checklist for evaluating images, your own or others, see the articles section of my website at jhhphoto.com. Actively participating in a critiquing group can really help you up your game. I regularly participate in 3 different critique groups, one of which I've been leading for 7 or 8 years. The groups range from 3 to about a dozen people, but I've found that in most cases 6 to 8 seems to work best. That allows us to look at 3 to 4 photos from each participant each meeting, sometimes more in the smaller groups. And we always start by asking the photographer to talk about the image, to tell us why they took it, what they were trying to say through the image, what they think works, and what they're not satisfied with. You really need to understand the photographer's vision for the piece before you can comment on how well they've achieved that vision or make suggestions to help them do it better. It's not helpful to give feedback based on how you would have made the image because it's not your image. What matters is their vision for the photo and how well they've accomplished that vision. So give your feedback from that point of view. And then we always invite suggestions and we try them out if possible. It really helps to actually work with the photo in a post-processing program like Lightroom as you discuss it. This helps you to see how to get it right in camera the next time and refines how we see and compose. I have a much more in-depth presentation on how to critique photos, but for now, let's look at how to receive the feedback that you're offered. First of all, consider the source. Ideally, you want to be critiqued by someone who is at the same level of expertise as you are or higher. This also applies to praise that you may receive as well as criticism. It's always nice to hear praise, and we want to receive it graciously, but don't take it too seriously if the person doesn't really know much about photography. When someone whose work I admire compliments me on a photograph, that means a lot. But most of the positive comments I get on social media, for example, come from folks who aren't photographers or artists. And so I accept their comments, but I don't put too much store in their judgment. I'm glad they found some pleasure in my image, but I don't let it go to my head. I quite like this meme that says some of the best advice I've been given: don't take criticism from people you would never go to for advice. Ask yourself if there are any specifics in the feedback you get that you can use. They say a wise person learns more from a fool than a fool learns from a wise person. And clarify if necessary. Make sure you understand what's being offered to you in terms of advice, and then try out the suggestions and only use them if they serve your vision. You want to also try to resist the impulse to let your ego get involved. If the feedback doesn't serve your vision, just set it aside. You are the artist, and when it comes to your work, the final judgment is yours. So to summarize, here are the 7 strategies I'm suggesting you use to get to wow. Train your eye, use your emotions, study and practice visual design, master light and lighting, develop your personal style, polish your post-processing skills, and seek constructive feedback from photographers and artists you respect. As I said when we started, wow is in the eye of the beholder. We are all wowed by different things in life and in photography. But by working on these 7 areas, you can move toward consistently producing high-quality images that are wows for you. There's an old story about a maestro who was racing up New York's 7th Avenue to a rehearsal when a stranger stopped him and said, "Pardon me, can you tell me how to get to Carnegie Hall?" "Yes," answered the maestro. "Practice, practice, practice." There are no shortcuts on the way to wow. You might get a lucky shot now and then, but to turn out consistently fine work, you've got to study, practice, and keep learning. It takes 10,000 hours to mastery, as we mentioned. Or as Henri Cartier-Bresson said, your first 10,000 photographs are your worst. And he was talking in the days of film. These days in the digital age, it's probably now more like 100,000. There are a lot of great books out there to help you in your journey to wow. Here are a few of my favorites. You might want to take a screenshot so that you can look these up. The Heart of the Photograph by David Duchemin is a wonderful examination of 100 questions that you can ask yourself when making an image. It's very thought-provoking. The Mindful Photographer by David Ulrich goes into some of the mindful practices that you might use when you're making an image. And Effortless Beauty by Julie DeBose looks into mixong photography. Julie, along with Michael Wood, established the school of mixong photography. God is at Eye Level was another one I found very helpful in terms of how I look at the world. And Photography in the Creative Life is an absolutely beautiful book by Nancy Rothenberg. Nancy Rothenberg passed away a few years ago, and this book is out of print, but you may be able to find it used, and it was reissued in a limited run a few years ago. So keep your eyes open for that one. And of course, Freeman Patterson, one of the giants of Canadian photography, has many books on photography that are all excellent. I think Photography and the Art of Seeing may be my favorite, and it's a great one to start with. Of course, there are lots of good tutorials on YouTube and lots of not so great ones too. You might find my tutorials on composition, black and white, flash, and critiquing photos helpful along your journey. Before we close, I'll just mention that I offer a dozen different presentations for camera clubs and also offer one-on-one mentoring and coaching as well as portfolio reviews. The presentations you see here in yellow are also on my YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining me. I hope you found it helpful. Remember to subscribe and hit the little bell icon so you'll be notified when I post new tutorials. And have fun on your journey to wow.